Hi everyone. In this presentation, Pratyush and I are going to be talking about the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex receives its convoluted appearance from a network of gyri, which are rounded ridges on the surface, and sulci, which are furrows separating each gyrus. The longitudinal fissure divides the brain into two hemispheres. The deep sulci separates the cerebral cortex into different lobes: the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Some of the main sulci which you should remember are the central sulcus, the lateral sulcus, the cingulate sulcus, the parieto-occipital sulcus, and the calcarine sulcus, which are mentioned on the image over here. It's also important to mention that the cerebral cortex is organized into distinct functional areas made up of sensory, motor, and association areas. It also plays a key role in high cognitive functions such as decision making, motivation, attention, learning, memory, problem solving, and conceptual thinking. On the image on the left, you can see the Brodmann areas. The Brodmann areas are basically just a numbered and designated system based on variations in the cellular architecture and organization observed under the microscope. These areas do not necessarily correspond to specific functional regions, but they provide a valuable framework for understanding the structural organization of the cortex. We'll talk about them in detail in the coming slides. On the table here, you can appreciate the list of sulci and gyri which are present in the cortex, and also the functional unit of the cortex itself, which is divided into specific lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. On the diagram to the right over here, this basically demonstrates the flow of information and how the cortex is divided functionally into primary, secondary, and tertiary areas. So the primary cortical area, it includes the primary motor area, which is anterior to the central sulcus, the primary sensory area, which is posterior to the central sulcus. Association areas mediates integrative processes, and they're divided into secondary and tertiary association areas. The secondary association areas are specific for each modality, meaning that they're found just adjacent to the primary area, as you can see in the diagram here. Each primary sensory area sends information to its own cortical association area. Each sensory association area appears necessary for perception of objects and events in its sensory modality. Primary areas receive only simple sensory information about contours, boundaries, and sensory qualities. And then it's sent to its own association area, which combine the information and represent complex objects. The motor area is organized in the same way. However, the flow of information is in reverse direction. From the motor association area, the information is sent to the primary area to the motor system in the brain. And tertiary association areas, they carry out complex mental processes not associated with any particular sense. Each secondary sensory and motor association areas send signals to higher order association areas. Here they combine this information to form the basis of the highest mental processes, examples including language, thinking, and planning.
Now I'll talk to you about the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe, as the name suggests, is the most anterior portion of the brain. The frontal lobe is the largest lobe of the cerebral cortex. There are a couple boundaries that separate the frontal lobe from the other lobes of the brain. The first one, as I'm showing here, is the central sulcus, and this divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe just posterior to it. Then we have the lateral sulcus, and this divides the frontal lobe once again from the temporal lobe just inferior to it. Now we'll talk about the functioning of the frontal lobe. The easiest way to remember this is to think of the word action. Now action refers to both mental and physical actions. Starting with the mental actions, these are going to include executive functioning that's primarily mediated by the neurotransmitter dopamine. And these executive functions will include things such as planning, problem solving, motivation, judgment, decision making, impulse control, social behavior, personality, memory, learning, reward, and attention. So as you can see, the frontal lobe plays a major role in determining our personality, behavior, and decisions that we make. Next, we'll talk about the physical actions. The physical action of the frontal lobe involves motor control, and this includes the planning, control, and execution of voluntary muscle movements. And these muscle movements are of the skeletal muscles, the muscles that help us move the eyes, muscles that help us produce and control speech, and muscles of the face. Now let's talk about certain areas of the frontal lobe that are involved in performing the specific functions that I mentioned before. The first one is located just anterior to the central sulcus, and this is known as the precentral gyrus, which is the anatomical name, and the functional name would be the primary motor cortex. The job of the primary motor cortex is to initiate and execute voluntary muscle movements. In this case, the brain would send information from the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe through the spinal cord out to the skeletal muscles to tell them to move. The next one is located just anterior to the primary motor cortex, and it's highlighted here in pink, and this is known as the motor association area. Now the motor association area or the motor association cortex consists of two areas, the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex. The common theme that we're going to see amongst all the lobes is that every primary cortex has an association cortex. And what the motor association cortex does is that it plans and coordinates the movements. On the other hand, the primary motor cortex would be more involved with the actual execution of the movement itself. The next functional area is located just anterior to the premotor area or the motor association area, and this is called the frontal eye field. It is fairly simple and it is involved with voluntary eye movements and specifically rapid eye movements. So far, we've only talked about the physical functions of the frontal lobe. Now we'll mention a few mental functions. And this is mainly done by this area over here, known as the prefrontal area. The prefrontal area, as we said before, is responsible for almost all the mental functions of the frontal lobe. And these are the executive functions that we spoke about before. Next and finally, within the frontal lobe would be Broca's area. It is also known as the motor speech area, and it receives data from the sensory speech center called Wernicke's area, which we'll talk about within the parietal lobe. The location of the Broca's area within the frontal lobe is unique because it is usually located in the dominant hemisphere. So in most people, it's going to be in the left hemisphere because they're right-handed. And once again, what it does is that it stimulates the muscles that help us produce speech. And that covers the main functional areas of the frontal lobe. In this slide, we're going to see something called the motor homunculus. What exactly it is that it's the body's representation within the cortical area, and these pictures show what the motor homunculus would be. Now, as you can see in the picture, as we move from the medial aspect to the lateral aspect of the primary motor cortex, you'd be moving from your lower body over here to your upper extremity and your face over here. Now, what this means is that the medial part of the primary motor cortex is going to be involved with movements of the lower extremity, whereas the lateral parts is going to be involved with movements of the upper extremity and the face. Now, the primary motor area also corresponds point by point to certain regions on the opposite side of the body. So this means that activity or stimulation of a particular part, or let's say the medial surface of the brain in this case, would cause movement of the muscles of the legs on the contralateral side of the body. This is what the motor homunculus talks about. Now, on the other hand, we also have something called a supplementary motor area. Now, what this is an area which is located on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, in particular the frontal lobe, and if you want to go deeper, it is the medial frontal gyrus. And in this area, the body is represented bilaterally. This means that unlike the primary motor area, stimulation of this area would evoke movements of the limbs and muscles on both sides of the body. Now that we're done with the frontal lobe, the other three lobes are going to be more involved with sensory functions rather than the motor. We'll start off with the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe sits right behind the frontal lobe, and there's once again a few boundaries to know of. We've already spoken about two, which makes it easier. The first one is the central sulcus, which divides the frontal area from the parietal lobe. Then we have the lateral sulcus, which extends into the parietal lobe, dividing it from the temporal lobe. Then we have something called the parieto-occipital sulcus, which divides the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe right behind it. Whenever we think of the function of the parietal lobe, we need to think of the word somatosensory. Now, what exactly does this word mean? Well, the parietal lobe is going to be involved in awareness of somatic sensation. This will include touch, pain, temperature, pressure, and vibration. It's also going to be involved in processing and analyzing this information, as well as storing it as memory so we can recognize it in the future. Lastly, we'll talk about proprioception with the parietal lobe. This is the coordination of all the sensory stimuli so we can develop spatial and body awareness. Just like we saw with the frontal lobe, there are specific cortical areas within the parietal lobe that correlate with these functions, and we're going to talk about those now. Using the central sulcus once again as our reference point, just posterior to it would be the post-central gyrus, which is once again the anatomical name, and the functional name would be the primary somatosensory cortex. This is similar to what we saw with the frontal lobe. Remember, just anterior to the central sulcus, we had the precentral gyrus, and that is where the primary motor cortex was. And now, posterior to the central sulcus, we have the primary somatosensory cortex, and it is also called the post-central gyrus. And this is going to be involved in conscious awareness of somatic sensations. Now, for the function of the primary somatosensory cortex, we see that it receives sensory information about the contralateral half of the body from the anterior thalamic nuclei. The anterior part of the primary somatosensory cortex would receive cutaneous information, and the posterior part would receive proprioceptive information. Now, with the primary somatosensory cortex, we become consciously aware of the sensation that we are feeling. Now we have to process this information and analyze them. And this is the job of the secondary somatosensory area. This is located posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex. So for example, if we close our eyes and there is no visual stimulus and we're handed an object, let's say an apple in this case, we can feel the shape, the firmness, the texture of that apple. Maybe we'd feel the stem, and we process and analyze that information, and we compare it to old memories from when we held an apple before. And through recognition of pattern, we'll know that we're holding an apple without actually seeing it. And this is what the somatosensory association cortex allows us to do. It processes and analyzes information. There's also a component of proprioception within the somatosensory association cortex. And the reason for this is that all the somatic stimuli would be entering this area, and it allows us to use all of them to realize where our body is in space. Now, there is another area known as the posterior association cortex. It is the part of the secondary somatosensory area which is a bit more posterior and dips a bit into the temporal and occipital lobe. And visual information from the occipital lobe, as well as auditory information from the temporal lobe and somatic information from the parietal lobe itself, would all collect in this area, giving us an idea of proprioception. So once again, the primary somatosensory area would be involved in all these somatosensory functions. Next, we would have something called the taste area or the gustatory area, and it is located in the parietal operculum of the insula. We'll talk about it later towards the end of the presentation. Finally, we have something called Wernicke's area, which is the sensory speech area, which we've already mentioned when talking about Broca's area in the frontal lobe. It is located within two gyruses, which are called supramarginal and angular gyri, and the role would be to understand auditory and visual information. Once it does this and comprehends this information, it sends signal to the motor speech area, which was the Broca's area, to produce speech. Both the sensory and the motor speech areas are primarily present within the dominant hemispheres. So once again, in right-handed people, that would be the left hemisphere of the brain. Just as we had a motor homunculus in the frontal lobe, we also have something called a sensory homunculus within the parietal lobe. Now, as we can see, similar to before, it is a body's representation within the cortical areas. The primary somatosensory areas would correspond to particular points on the contralateral side of the body. So somatosensory information from, let's say, the legs would go to the medial aspect of the parietal lobe, and somatosensory information from the face and the hands would go more towards the lateral aspect of the primary somatosensory cortex. The body's representation would depend on the sensitivity of the part. So areas such as the tongue and the hand, which have more receptors, would have a larger representation and a larger area in comparison to an area such as the back. Now, apart from this, we also have something called the supplementary association area located in the superior part of the parietal lobe, and it receives impulses from the primary somatosensory area and integrates them and stores them for long-term memories of past experiences. And this comes in particularly handy in the example which I had mentioned in the previous slide, such as the one of the apple, and it gives us the ability to recognize familiar objects by touch.
So now let's talk about the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe consists of three gyri separated by two sulci. The three gyri are the superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. And they are separated by two sulci, as mentioned, the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus. The superior temporal gyrus contains a specialized region known as the primary auditory area. According to the Brodmann classification, it's the Brodmann area 41 and 42. This region of the cerebral cortex is primarily responsible for the reception of auditory information. Posterior to the primary auditory area in the superior temporal gyrus is the auditory association area. This is the Brodmann area number 22. This region is responsible for interpretation of sounds and for the association of the auditory input with other sensory information. The posterior part of this region in the dominant hemisphere, which is usually on the left side of the brain, corresponds to the Wernicke area. This area is very important for comprehension of language. The middle temporal gyrus and the inferior temporal gyrus have their own associated functions. The middle temporal gyrus is associated with the perception of movement within the visual field, and the inferior temporal gyrus plays a role in facial recognition. Now we'll talk about the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is responsible for the sense of vision. It also contains a part of the facial recognition area on its inferior surface. The occipital lobe forms the caudal aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. On the medial surface of the occipital lobe, we have the calcarine sulcus. This sulcus divides the lobe into two parts: the cuneus, which lies above, and the lingual gyrus, which lies below. The region of both gyri adjacent to the calcarine sulcus forms the primary visual cortex. This cortex is the Brodmann area number 17 and is responsible for the integration and perception of visual information. It receives visual information from the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus through the optic radiation. Adjacent to this region, we have the association areas, which are Brodmann areas number 18 and 19. These are concerned with storing past visual experiences and discriminating colors. We can finally talk about the insular lobe. The insula is a portion of the cerebral cortex which lies deep within the lateral sulcus, covered completely by the frontal, parietal, and temporal regions. The central sulcus divides the insula into an anterior zone, composed of the short gyri, and a posterior zone, composed of a long gyri. The anterior insula is mainly involved in the processing of olfactory, gustatory, and autonomic and limbic information. The posterior insula is principally involved in processing somatic, auditory, and motor information. The insula plays an important role in cognition, emotion, and motivation.